womb, I've been yours. So as a young man, he is shepherding. He's in his teens at this point. He's playing music. He's writing songs. He's pouring his heart out to the Lord. And Samuel comes in to anoint him. And you have this beautiful moment that we all reference now, and I think maybe we've, again, become too familiar. Samuel asks Jesse to line up all his sons. He sees Eliab, the oldest, big, handsome, strong guy, and he says, surely this is the one you have chosen, which was actually a little bit unusual because Samuel didn't really miss stuff. It was said of him that none of his words actually fell to the ground. So this just indicates that the Lord was setting something up that we would all hear and experience for all time, be able to reference. So he says, surely this is the chosen of the Lord, and God says, nope, that's not him. And one by one, he goes through each of the sons, and then Samuel's confused, and he's like, what is going on? And in this process, the Lord says, stop looking at the external. It's not what I look at. I look at the heart, right? I mean, we know this story. This is just profound because David's an outcast in the family, and Samuel asks Jesse, are there any other sons? Like, what's going on here? We're missing something. And he says, oh, yeah, David's over there mowing the yard. You know, like he says he's over there like you can see him, like he's just in the distance. So imagine yourself in David's shoes here. Samuel is the most important man in the nation outside of the king. He's certainly the most feared because of the power of God that he walks in. He comes to town. He's so freaky scary that the leaders of the town come out and they're like, are you here for peace? Or are you going to bring the fire? And he's like, no, I'm here for peace. Gather together, and we're going to sacrifice to the Lord together. So this is like a president that you like showing up to town. And there's some great spiritual, and Billy Graham, everybody loves Billy Graham, shows up to town. They're coming to your house, and your parents are like, get out in the field and mow while he's here. I mean, the opportunity for rejection is tremendous here. I mean, this can't really be understated. But we don't see it. David comes in. He gets anointed to be king from the Lord, for the Lord, by Samuel, and then he just goes back to what he was doing. He just goes right back into watching his sheep, to caring for them, writing his songs, pouring his heart out. This is strange. I mean, really, because when I was a teenager, I was so arrogant. I would have thought it was happening tomorrow. You know what I mean? Like, Saul's getting taken out, I'm getting put in, I have no experience, but it probably means I have everything it takes. So I'm going to show up, and I'm going to rock this, and it's going to be great. But we don't really see any of this in David. He just continues being faithful to what's already in his hands. And he trusts, this is one of the defining factors of David's life. He has absolute confidence in God's sovereignty and God's commitment to him. So throughout David's life, you actually won't find him fighting his own battles. Consistently and repeatedly, God moves, God moves on his behalf to fight for him. And interestingly, it's really fighting for David's heart. On the note of David not fighting for himself, consider from the point he was anointed until he was king, it was between 13 and 15 years. Okay, and about 9 of those years he spent in the wilderness, and he was, for periods of this, being actively pursued by Saul and his army, trying to kill him, for no clear reason other than Saul had become exceptionally jealous. In this process, when Saul gets close enough to him, all his men are like, let me kill him or you kill him. I'll give you 2 options. There's no third option. Saul's going down today. And David would say, A, I'm not going to touch the Lord's anointed, but B, and this is the crazy thing, is that he calls him father. Twice he gets close enough to Saul to kill him. At one point he takes the corner of his robe. Another time he takes some stuff that was laying by Saul's head while he was sleeping. And he speaks with affection to the man that wanted to kill him. This was David being a man that God chose for himself, that would reveal the heart of God. There's a spot over there too. So we're gonna. Here's kind of the point, the takeaway of that fundamental reality of David's life, that he believed God would fight his battles and that God's sovereignty was really good, is that we don't really know God's long game for our life. None of us do. We can see where we are right now. Maybe you have some prophetic words. David had a pretty big prophetic word that was even followed up with some physical anointing by the man who anointed people for such things. And at no point does he force his timeline. He had to go through these processes and these seasons where God was working things in him, because the big picture to be a man truly after God's heart was that, A, when you were rejected and demoted and cast off and hated and despised, that it actually didn't carry an enormous amount of weight, and it didn't have an enormous amount of effect on you. And to the measure that you could walk in that, however much you were promoted, loved, celebrated, rejoiced over, it would have the same effect. Because it's like this, Sean's guitar, this is like the value you have in being loved by God. And this box of Altoids is like the value you have from the praise of men or the rejection of men. There's not even close to the same comparison, right? This is so much more valuable. So this is the way that David saw his life. He was so loved and sure in God's love for him that it was like the beautiful big guitar compared to the box of Altoids or a pencil that just really didn't matter. Those things were the praise of man, or the hatred of man, or the promotion or the demotion, whatever these things are. It just didn't move him, It just didn't move him. So it didn't really matter in the scope of life and what he was doing, what happened to around him, because he was like, God, it's just me and you, and I so trust your leadership in my life that I'll wait as long as it takes. And you know what? Even if you change your mind about me, I'm okay, because it's me and you. Psalm 27, he says, there's one thing I desire. Whew. To gaze on your beauty, to be in your courts all the days of my life. This is the shepherd after God's heart. This is the model of the covenant for our part. It's like the story of David is so beautiful because we see amazing and incredible things in the life of Jesus, but like John said, if everything was written down that he did, there wouldn't be enough books to fill the world. So there's all these other things about the heart of God that we actually don't see in the Gospels. And biblically speaking, God sets a reference point and he says, look over here because you'll find my heart for the new covenant in this man's life. And the starting point is how merciful I was with him. So observe his life, see the way that I interacted with David, and then walk into that together, me and you, personal encounter, personal revelation. I want you to be loved the way that I loved David. Have you guys heard, in the last few years, if you're following any selective circles, you'll hear a lot of Isaiah 22:22 and talks about the key of David. Does anybody know what the key of David is? It's a reference to intimacy. Okay? Kind of going all over the place here, but it fits together. Has anybody here studied the Tabernacle of David? Yeah. The Tabernacle of David is fascinating because it wasn't a directive given from heaven to man. It was the overflow of David's heart for God. So he sets up this huge tent, puts the Ark of the Covenant in there, and gathers all these musicians and singers and worshipers and priests, and they sit here and they just minister to the Lord 24/7. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, starts off with hundreds, ends up with thousands by the end of his reign. Thousands of people every day just ministering to the Lord. Why? Because David loved the Lord, right? I'm going to give you this phrase because it'll change a lot if you haven't heard it. My favorite description of prayer is the language of intimacy. Okay? When Jesus said, my house will be a house of prayer, when it was prophesied in Isaiah 56, it's referencing David's tabernacle that was the functional house of prayer, the whole thing being an expression of intimacy. And in that note, just a side note, but David would sit before the Lord in that place. And did you know that he had repeated encounters and prophetic visions where he saw Jesus and where he saw the millennial reign, where he saw the last days, where he saw the future, the heaven that we think of that we'll be existing in? These were things that, I like to think of them like this. These were just treasures that God was sharing heart to heart with him. You know, there's this crazy thing about intimacy that lets you, okay, back to the tabernacle. Well, this is the point. There's crazy things in that place of intimacy that it's almost like you can cross lines, not lines of immorality, but you can cross like structural lines. And what I mean is, David functioned as a priest and kings weren't allowed to function as priests. Why? Because he had the heart of a priest, probably more than any of the priests at the time, to minister to the Lord. So when he creates the tabernacle, it's this expression from his heart to the Lord. It's just like, I love you. I want you to be worshiped. I want you to be honored, and I want you to have our attention and our affection, and I don't want it to ever stop. And then later we discover that at some point in this process, God stepped in and he said, yeah, actually, I'm going to make that a statute for all generations. That the way that you will worship me will be this kind of worship. And it was worked into Solomon's temple, and it was actually commanded to all the kings from that point forward, let this always be the way that you worship me. This will be my house of prayer for all nations. And there was actually not a stop to it. Most theologians agree that in the early church, this was the format that was carried on when they gathered daily. So another way that you could describe this confidence with the Lord, another way that it manifested was actually in humility, right? David was promoted many times and then sideways kind of transferred into a demotion where he was trying to be killed. But in each promotion, it says that he actually gained the favor of the people that he was with. He gained the favor of the servants that he served with in Saul's court. And mind you, when he was going to Saul's court to play music to calm Saul from the demonic oppression by playing his instrument, during that time, for roughly 2 to 3 years, he was just traveling back and forth between Saul's palace and his hometown, which is about 7 miles. So he'd come in, be in the court, stand in the council of Saul, and then just go home and keep mowing the yard. And it wasn't a thing to him. He just did what was before him. But when he comes in, it says that he actually gained the favor of the servants he served with. And then when Saul gets mad at him, he's like, you know what? I'll make him a commander of some of my army, and I'll send him into really dangerous places so he gets killed because I hate him. David is a young man, probably in his 20s at this point. And he's put in charge of a bunch of people who've been warriors for twice as long as he's been alive. How many people think that would go well? Nobody thinks that would go well. We know that wouldn't go well. But it went well. What does it say about David? There was a consistent demonstration of humility and wisdom and prudence on David's life where he could step into a situation like that as a younger man and cause all the people that he's leading and walking with to love him and to serve with him and to honor him. Yet we know that his affection for those people was quite possibly what won them over. He was so thoughtful and kind to them. They were so important to him. They were not like pawns on a chessboard to be used in war. And one of the greatest demonstrations of this is with the mighty men, and he's hanging out with his bros. It's late, and they're kind of at the edge of this battle. And he says, "Oh, I remember how sweet the water was from this well on the other side of the enemy's lines." And so a couple of his warrior bros run across lines, scoop up some water, and bring it back to him. And he pours it out because he says, I can't drink this, essentially because your lives are worth so much more to me than this water. Like, at first read, it's kind of this, it looks offensive, but it wasn't. He was saying, I know you risked this for me. I don't want you to risk that for me. You're too important to me. So this was another aspect of David's leadership that was present. This was another aspect of God's heart present in David's life. And I'm trying to decide if I'm going to share one more story. If hopefully that's enough to get you guys encouraged to go read. So maybe I will in a second. But big picture, David's life takes place in 1 and 2 Samuel. This is the bulk of his story. This is where you see a lot of the detailed happenings. There's a kind of a shorter recount through 1 Chronicles. And then you get a lot of the raw emotion and the raw struggle and heart language of David's life through the Psalms, of which he wrote around 80, a little, more than half. So if you're going to study it, that's where you start. You can read all of 1st and 2nd Samuel in like half a day. It goes by pretty quick. And you'll also find that the life of Saul is in the first 15 chapters, primarily kind of walking through Samuel's introduction, giving him the premise, then the life of Saul and his kingship, and then the fight between the two of them, and then David's kingship on the back half of 2 Samuel. If you do go there, the adjacent nature of David's life and Saul's life is there for a reason. And you'll find a lot of the ways that just leaders and kings of this world operate in the life of Saul. And you'll find the way that leaders after God's heart operate in the life of David. Let me think one more story here. Big picture relevance here is really that David he's like the model for leadership today. He's the model for walking in covenant with God today. In Acts, it says he was obedient to everything that the Lord set before him. So he was a model of obedience. But the thing that I think sometimes we miss is that the obedience, where it came from. The obedience came from his heart relationship with the Lord. It wasn't obedience for obedience sake. He was in love. Did you know he was the first person in the Bible to write a poem or a song that just flat out said, "I love you, God"? He was the first one to say that. There's so much beauty in David's life. Okay. Okay, last thing. David, a man who was intent on giving his life to the Lord and following him alone, in that process, became the greatest at what he did in every area of his life, but not for himself. He was unbelievably faithful with whatever the Lord put before him. Whatever it was, whether it was going to be seen or not seen, he put his whole heart into it and literally became the best. But it wasn't about becoming the best. It was his service to the Lord. It was being faithful with whatever God had for him to do, whether it was mowing the yard and then getting into the courts of the king and then going back to mowing the yard, or becoming the greatest warrior in the nation, having songs written about him, and then being pursued by the entirety of the government to be killed. It wasn't the thing for him. Being the great warrior wasn't the thing. But being a warrior is part. He demonstrated it, that he would fight. It says that he was victorious in all of the Lord's battles for him. Whatever the Lord's battles are for you in that place, there is victory. Right? Okay, I'll be done. So, I was praying we'll be done. Father, you said that you would today give us shepherds after your heart. We want to be shepherds after your heart. We want to be like David was in his relationship with you, the way he viewed the people around him, the way he was faithful in his work, the way he trusted you in seasons of promotion and demotion, that those things weren't the main things. God, we want to be so caught up in our relationship with you and being loved by you and knowing you that that is the great prize, that is the great desire of the heart, that we would be anointed for your purposes, whatever you want, whether that's seen or not seen, whether that's out front or in obscurity, that our hearts could be settled before you. Give us hearts like David. And I just ask for every one of us who is interested in studying David's life to encounter you and to be transformed by your word, that you would release a special grace today for it. and that we would have encounter and revelation. But most of all, that our hearts would be knit with yours. God, thank you. Thank you for this example. Thank you for putting him in the Word with all of the failures and the flaws so that we wouldn't quickly disqualify ourselves, but that we would remember your covenant based on the sure mercies of David, that we saw what you can do with weak and struggling and broken people, and that when we screw up, we would quickly sign back up and jump back on board with you, knowing that you are still for us just as much, and that you can still work out your plans for us. Thank you for your mercies. Thank you for the life of David. Thank you for the covenant that you brought into play through Jesus. We love you. We love you. We love you. We love you. Give us grace. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen.
Well, I trust that you were blessed by the Lord today, and we look forward to seeing
has
you
the interpretation
online
of the tongue of that baby
next
there at the
Sunday.
end, please
In the
stand up.
meantime, if you would like to learn more about us, about our school of ministry,
there'll be a few of us up here
or
for
other
prayer if y'all need
resources,
prayer otherwise.
or you would like to
bless
sow
y'all.
into
Don't forget to
Cross
put your
Kingdom
cards in the
Ministries and
basket
help
still.
us further the gospel to the
there
ends
are
of the
15
earth,
tickets left for
simply go to
Tabernacle for next week.
crosskingdom.org.
And
We'll see you all next
yeah,
week.
so awesome. Anything else? Bless y'all and stop.